So we're talking about Messianic prophecy tonight, and it's not that we've never done this topic, but there's no way that we would possibly be able to go over all the Messianic prophecies. When I became a believer in the mid 90s, probably 1994 is when I became a follower of Jesus. I would wander into the Christian bookstores at the time because there was a lot of them, as you know. We didn't have the internet and we didn't have Amazon and all these other options to buy things. So if you wanted to get Christian books, you went to the stores. And so I'd show up at Christian bookstores and look at their apologetics section, and I would always find some of the same books talking about the same stuff. Um, but a lot of them had a lot of information about Messianic prophecy in them. And then since I was around Jewish people who believed in Jesus, I was in a congregation of Messianic Jews. That was one of their main things, why they believed Jesus was a Messiah because of Messianic prophecy. And then I tried to share Messianic prophecy with some of my Jewish friends. Of course, most of them were biblically illiterate anyway, so they never really read much of the Bible, or especially the Old Testament. And so, they didn't know much. So I just got it. I just learned a lot about Messianic prophecy very early on. Found out a lot of arguments that um, some people were making that weren't very good, and then other ones that needed refining. So anyway, so we've been talking about so far some of the reasons God exists, and we've mostly been, we spent a lot of time on the section just establishing the existence of God, and we spent a lot of time on. We talked about some of the design arguments, some of the cosmological arguments, the moral arguments, some of those other things. So we are kind of in Roman numeral 2 for a while. And then we've moved on to Roman numeral 3. We're up in that range. And we did some things on the Bible last week. And I told you that, if you want to watch that other clip I had about translation and transmission of the Bible. But anyway, so we started to get into the Bible a little more now in history. So that's where we're kind of at tonight on letter B here, as far as Messianic prophecy, okay? Um, so it is true that, the Bible is obviously considered to be God's revelation to humanity. At least that's what Orthodox Christians and evangelical Christians believe. We believe that God has used a text to communicate to humanity. And we know that we have other competitors out there. We have Muslims who think that the Quran is the true revelation of God. It's the final revelation. Of course, Mormons come along with the Book of Mormon, and these people believe that God gave new revelation after Jesus came and after he died and rose from the dead, and the Bible was completed. They still think that God was giving newer revelation later on in history. We've talked about over the course of many calls why that's a problem. Why that's a problem. Obviously, all these revelations contradict each other. They all can't be true. And then we talked a little bit about history, how God has decided to reveal himself in the course of history. So if you want to know what God's like, and people say, I can't know if God exists, I'm not sure if God exists, I'm not sure I can know. And they talk about, I don't think we can know. Can we know? Well, they're talking about knowledge of God, right? How can you have knowledge of God? And knowledge of God, as we talked about, is given through the created order. We talked about some of the things in the natural world, and now we're talking about how God has given knowledge of himself in the context of human history. So, prophecy doesn't necessarily prove the existence of God or prove the existence of the God of the Bible, but it is one of your things you can put in your tool belt. And it certainly shows that God is involved in the world. He's doing things. He's active. He's not like a deistic God, right? Where he just created the world and then he was hands off. That's the opposite. So, if you're talking to somebody and they don't know most people don't know how to think about God. They don't know how to think about the existence of God. They don't know how to think about how to like approach the existence of God. You just need to ask them if it's plausible that God would communicate through history. Does it make sense if he wants humanity to know what he's like and wants humanity to know what he has for them, what our purpose is, that just ask him, does it make sense that he would communicate through a text? Would he give us a text? And, most people, believe it or not, would say, yeah, I guess he's got to communicate somehow. I mean, maybe they want him to do it a different way. They want to put demands on God and say he needs to communicate to humanity this way or that way. And by golly, I'm not going to believe till he does it my way, but they're wasting their time because you are the created ones and he's the creator. So he sets the parameters on how he's going to reveal himself to humanity. And what he's going to set the parameters on how he wants to communicate, because we are the finite ones and he is the infinite one. So we go by his rules. Okay. Now, if someone would come to me and say, if I really, really want to go deeper on Messianic prophecy, I definitely recommend these books. They're all really good. And I remember reading The Messiah in the Old Testament a long time ago by Walter Kaiser. Still have that book on my shelf. I've met Walter Kaiser before. I think he's still alive. I think he's like 90, probably like 96 years old, my dad's age or something, but great Old Testament scholar. He once debated a rabbi on the topic. You can look it up online. Walter Kaiser debates a rabbi named Pinchas Lapid. Just type in Walter Kaiser debates rabbi. I think the transcript is online. And then you have some of these other books that are all really good. Michael Brown's book answers a lot of Jewish objections to Messianic prophecy. That's the specialty. It's got 5 volumes answering Jewish objections to Jesus. So that's the one he specializes in on Messianic prophecy. These are all good. If you just want to learn a little bit about Jewish messianism and things like that, they're all really good books. So if you want to go deeper, I recommend some of those resources. I would definitely, if you can get the Moody Handbook of Messianic Prophecy, that's something that came out over the last 5 years. So there's a lot going on in that book. So anyway, and then there's my book, which is actually, I'm up to 20 million copies I've sold of this. 20 million. Did you know that? I have outsold Lee Strobel's The Case for Christ. 20 million copies of Is Yeshua the Jewish Messiah? Okay, if you don't get my sarcasm and humor by now, you're in big trouble. I have not sold 20 million copies. That's a joke. I've sold maybe 20 copies of this, maybe 200 copies. I don't know. I don't count them. But anyway, if you want to get this book, it's only $2.99 on Kindle. So that's a short little book I give to certain people, but it's only like 46 to 50 pages. So, okay. So we know that in the New Testament, when you read the New Testament, we know that when you're reading the sermons in the book of Acts, and if you just read a lot of the New Testament, we know that they quote the Old Testament a lot. We know that there's a ton of messianic passages that they appeal to show Jesus is the Jewish Messiah. If you read Peter's sermon in the book of Acts, he always mentions things in the Old Testament. If you read Paul's preaching, the book of Acts, chapters 1 to 11 feature, I think it's 1 to 12 have Peter's preaching, and then 13 on is Paul. Acts 13 on is Paul. But as both of them appeal to the Old Testament continuously about how Jesus fulfills the Old Testament certain ways. And we know that they're preaching to Jews, and most Jews in the first century already believed in God. Most Jews today do not believe in God. So you can't necessarily just do it the way they did it in the first century. You can't just open Messianic prophecies. You can maybe with some of them, but the point is that we live in a different world today. And in the first century, they didn't have to establish the existence of God with their Jewish audience. When Peter starts preaching Acts 2, Acts 2 and 3 and other places, that he's talking to Jewish people who already believe in God. And it's a God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right? So he can start with the Old Testament prophecy. That's why in Acts 17, that Paul, when he's in Athens, he doesn't use Messianic prophecy. He uses creation to reach the Greeks, right? today you generally have to use creation to reach the Jews because a lot of the Jews don't start with the Old Testament. They don't read it. But there's all kinds of Messianic prophecy texts all through Acts where they keep quoting the Old Testament over and over. And there's passages that say that Paul, like in Acts 17, he went in, he reasoned with the Jews from the scripture, explaining and proving that Jesus was the Christ. In Acts 18:20, Apollos vigorously refuted the Jews in public debate, proving from the scriptures that Jesus was the Christ. So you see this, they're using Messianic prophecy a lot. They're using the scriptures, okay, with the Jews, all right? And that's pretty exciting. Like I said, you can probably use some Messianic prophecy, Old Testament things with Orthodox Jews today or Jews that read the scriptures. Of course, they read a lot of the rabbinical literature too, but with secular Jews, it can be a little harder because a lot of them are biblically illiterate. They don't read the Bible. Now, we know that Jesus used prophecy many times. Paul used it, as I said. God used it in the Old Testament to show he was the one true God. So it certainly is used to show that the Bible is unique and that God is the one true God, the God of the Bible. And as I said, statistically today, trying to use Messianic prophecy with Jewish people is a real challenge because I said many Jews don't think you need to even believe in God to be Jewish, and you don't need to believe in God to be Jewish. Jews will tell you that. They'll say, listen, I'm ethnically Jewish. I'm accepted by my community, and that's all that matters. And it's not like you have to walk around and prove you're Jewish by your faith in God. Of course, Orthodox Jews would like to see more secular and Jews believe in God, but the reality of it is a lot of Jewish people do not believe in God, but they're still Jewish. There was a Pew survey back in 2020 says overall about a quarter of U.S. Jewish adults do not identify with the Jewish religion. They consider themselves to be Jewish ethnically, culturally, or by family background, and have a Jewish parent or were raised Jewish, but they answer a question about their current religion by describing themselves as atheist, agnostic, or nothing particular, rather than as Jewish. So there you go. Just to reemphasize my point. Now, we also know that using Messianic prophecy today can be challenging, once again, with Jewish people or just people in general, because people are very pragmatic. They're interested in how would believing in Jesus make a difference in my life? How would this help me? How would this help me to be a better father, or husband, or a wife, or a worker? Or how does this better my life? They see everything in very um, pragmatic ways. And they're also interested in personal experience. Messianic prophecy is a very evidential-based apologetic. Okay, it's not Messianic prophecy has nothing to do with personal experience. Really, it's not about giving your personal testimony. It's not about whether it works for you in your life. You're looking at Old Testament texts and seeing how they find fulfillment in the life of Jesus. Okay, and how Jesus came and he actually showed up in history as a real person, and he did certain things or lived out certain patterns that were already talked about in the Old Testament. Okay. Um, you can certainly have a personal experience with God. That's fine. And Christianity can make a difference in your life. But just remember that Mormons and Muslims have personal experiences with their God, and they think that their faith makes a difference in their life as well. So you're going to need a little more than that to engage our culture around you. You're going to need some other things on your apologetic tool belt, as I've talked about before. Now, it comes to defining prophecy. Some people think that it's only about someone predicting the future. That of course, some people, when they think of prophecy, think of like Nostradamus, that guy that supposedly had all these predictions about the future. I don't have time to go into all that, um, but a lot of times people just think of prediction or fulfillment. And that is part of prophecy, but prophecy is also just preaching truth, saying truth. Every time you hear sermons every week in your church, that's prophecy. Okay. Anytime you're in a Bible study and someone's proclaiming the word, that's prophecy. Um, so it's not always just predicting something. Okay. It's just speaking for truth. Okay. A lot of times. So when the prophets would go into Israel, we know that they rebuked, God would send them to rebuke the Jewish people and try to bring them back to repentance. They're speaking for truth, right? God's words to them, trying to call them to repentance, right? Calling out their sins and saying, you need to repent, all those issues, right? Now, when I was a new Christian as well, when I would read some of the old apologetic works like Josh McDowell's work or others, they would say there's 365 messianic prophecies. I don't really think so anymore. I don't really buy that argument. I think it's kind of very general. So I would say that if you study them more carefully and you buckle down and really do the homework, I would say there's maybe 30 to 40 really good ones. When I mean really good ones, I mean using the scriptures correctly and not just reading like a line out of context, not doing it this way, like all the apologetic books did that I read. You'd have like one passage here in the Old, and they talked about how it's fulfilled in the New Testament. I don't really like that approach because it's just you're not reading the passages in context, and then you have to look at it. Sometimes you have to do language studies. You have to see if it's really even a messianic prophecy. Okay, it might not even be a messianic prophecy. And furthermore, you need to know how the New Testament uses the Old Testament because New Testament authors use the Old Testament different ways. Okay, what we think of prophecy, think of prediction and fulfillment, like we call direct fulfillment. Like there's a correspondence, a one-to-one correspondence. So I'm not wild about this approach. I think to understand these texts, you need to read them in context before you jump to just saying, "Oh, there's a prophecy thing and there's a fulfillment." It's not that they're irrelevant. I'm not saying that. It's God's word. Of course, it's relevant. I'm just saying that you need to read them in context and really read. Um, Make sure that you're just doing your homework. Go back and read some of those books that I gave you at the beginning, some recommendations. That's what I'd recommend. Oh, here's my summary. I'm sorry, I had it on slides. So, like I said, it doesn't that approach doesn't look at the passages in the immediate context. It doesn't consider the original audience the prophecy or passage was written to, because remember those prophecies were written to a certain audience in their time period, right? So they have to know what they mean to them. I mean, they have to have relevance to them. It's not just like, well, they just point to Jesus, so they don't mean anything to us. That's why you have what's called double fulfillment or dual fulfillment passages. Things they have short-term fulfillment and long-term fulfillment. Sometimes you need to look at the languages, and then sometimes, of course, you need to interpret it correctly. So now, when it comes to Jews, of course, the concept of Messiah is that it's from Judaism. The concept of a Jewish Messiah, it belongs to Israel. I mean, comes out of Israel's history, right? So it's not like the Christians made up the whole idea of a Messiah. It's not like you have a Christian Messiah and a Jewish Messiah or something like that. And so, I just want to make sure that we understand that. Excuse me, I'm sorry. Son had an issue. But anyway, so I recommend if you want to learn a little more about Jewish messianism, get some of these books, see what the history of Jewish messianism has been. Have Jews thought about their Messiah? Is it what's the relationship between the way Jews view their Messiah and how we view our, what's the relationship between we believe, right? Because there has to be a relationship between the two. Okay, they're not like two different things. There's been messianic figures throughout history. Not all of them claim to be the Messiah. So when someone says to you, "Oh, there's many people who claim to be the Messiah over history, and Jesus is just one of many," that's not true. There's only maybe a handful or maybe four or five really big figures that really not even necessarily claim to be the Messiah. Some of the followers they had claimed they were the Messiah. So um, these three figures have all been figures within um, Jewish history that people thought were some kind of messianic figure. Okay. Um, Give me 1 second here. Sorry. And so that's okay. Just 1 second here. There we go. Back to this. So yeah, some of these figures right here. They all died, and they had some followers. And the guy on the far right, um, the Rebbe Schneerson, you can go to Israel. His posters are still around Israel to this day, and you can find some of his followers there. They think he is the Messiah. They think he's coming back. He has a small group of Orthodox Jews that follow him, the Hasidic community. But if when I was in Israel, if anyone's been to Israel, you can see his little posters. They'll say the Rebbe, or might say the Rebbe's coming, or something like that. But he's dead. There's these people, they're all dead, and they're not risen from the dead. So when we say, like, Jesus is the Messiah, we're talking about, we say Jesus is the Christ from the word Christos, right? And of course, in Judaism and in Hebrew, it's Mashiach. Okay, when we say Jesus is the Messiah, he's the Mashiach, he's the anointed one. And we know that there are certain figures in the Old Testament are anointed to do things for God. Prophets, priests, and kings were all anointed to do things for God. Okay, King David was anointed. The Spirit came upon David at certain times, but he didn't indwell David. We know the prophets and priests were anointed. Okay, but that's not the same thing as saying those people are all the Messiah. Okay, so there were figures certainly were anointed to do things. King Cyrus was anointed as well, right? But he's not the Messiah. So we say Jesus the Messiah, we say Yeshua HaMashiach, right? HaMashiach, the Jewish Messiah. He is the Messiah of Israel, and he's the Messiah of the nations. You can't divorce those from each other, but it's not one without the other. It's not like a Christian Messiah and a Jewish Messiah. He's a Jewish Messiah. Now, some people say that, of course, Jews will generally say that Jesus overall didn't perform the messianic task. He didn't fulfill what the Messiah did. And that's why a lot of Jews don't believe he's a Messiah today. Now, some Jews, as I said, don't care. Some of them never read the Old Testament. Some of them are just secular. But the general consensus is that Jesus didn't do what the Messiah is supposed to do. Of course, you study Judaism, there's so many different views of the Messiah. There's not one expectation. So you have to narrow that down as well. And then some Christians say, well, he did do it. He did do what the Messiah is supposed to do, but he did it spiritually. He didn't, and he didn't bring a future, he didn't bring a physical kingdom on earth, but he'll do that in the future. That's what we call futurism, where he will do the physical thing later on. Okay, but most Jews today believe kind of what Peter thought was going to happen in Acts chapter 1 when he asked Jesus, are you going to restore the kingdom of Israel? Jesus was already resurrected from the dead, but he had not, from Peter's expectation from reading the Old Testament, Jesus had not done everything that the Old Testament said the Messiah is supposed to do, just kind of like today. So when Jews look at some of the passages in the Old Testament, these are all very physical things, that the land will be different, that the Messiah will be in the land, that the Jerusalem will be at the center of the earth, that Israel not be hated by all the world, and that all the nations will be in a good relationship with Israel. You have a lot of physical changes happening here, and that's what Peter thought was going to happen. And that's why he asked Jesus in Acts chapter 1. He said, are you going to do these things now? Are you going to restore the kingdom of Israel? All these second coming passages, Peter wanted them in the first coming. And just like many Jews today, they think that what we think will happen at the second coming will happen the first coming. Now, some Christians today ignore these passages and say they won't happen in the second coming because Israel has nothing to do with with God's Israel's kind of out of the picture now. That's where we get replacement theology or supersessionism, or whatever you want to call it. A lot of Christians, they think Jesus came and he reconfigured these passages around himself, and so he doesn't. There's no real direct fulfillment of these passages in the future. The challenge is that when you read the first coming passages, are that they are historically fulfilled in Jesus, literally historically fulfilled, and so why would you switch your hermeneutic and completely say that these passages are just like done away with, or they just get allegorized, whatever you want to say? Um, this is a common Jewish objection by David Kleinhofer. Um, common view that Jews think the Messiah, when he comes, just like I showed you on that chart, there's a gathering of Jewish exiles back to the land. Um, there's a new temple. The nations recognize God in Israel. I mean, Israel's recognized in a positive way. There is a new covenant that happens, just like I talked about right back here. There's all kinds of that. When I have that part national Israel spiritually regenerate, that's what the new covenant is, because it's written to Israel in the Old Testament. There's no mention of Gentiles in the New Testament. I mean, in the new covenant passages in the Old Testament, there's no mention of Gentiles in Jeremiah 31 and Ezekiel 36. That's why Paul says we're grafted in Romans 11. That's how we get into the new covenant, because we're grafted in. But these yeah, so this is a typical traditional view of the Messiah, and then they just say, well, Jesus didn't do it, case closed. It's not that simple, though. So most Jewish expectations of the Messiah are that the reign of God all happens at once. It's visible. God's enemies are defeated. There is a physical kingdom on earth. The Messiah is on earth in Jerusalem. He's ruling from Israel. So they would say, well, there's no, the Old Testament doesn't talk about first and second comings. But the problem is that, yes, it's true. The Old Testament doesn't use the phrase doesn't say first coming, second coming. I agree, it doesn't say that. But there are obviously prophecies about two periods of history. And the prophets didn't always understand that. They didn't understand the way it worked. I mean, they could be given a prophecy and then they have no idea when that's going to be fulfilled. Is it going to be fulfilled progressively, like over time, or is it going to be a one specific time it's all fulfilled at once? Or is it just progressively fulfilled over time, like Jews being regathered to the land? There's all kinds of Old Testament passages about God bringing Israel back to the land. That's been progressively being fulfilled, has been progressively fulfilled over history. It's not like one thing happens all at once. So there's no way the prophets could know certain things, like when they're going to be fulfilled exactly and what's going on. I mean, they're probably thinking, what's going on in our time? How do these things matter to us today? Okay, so I agree. There's nothing in the Old Testament that says first and second coming, but you have first coming prophecies about the first coming of Jesus. You have second coming prophecies. These are second coming prophecies right here. And so the first coming has to do with the Messiah's death and atonement, and the second coming has to do with him making a physical kingdom on earth. But you generally have, generally different kinds of messianic prophecy. A first appearance or first coming, first appearances of Jesus, and you have the second appearance or second coming. Then some of the prophecies seem to be split in half, where you have prophecies about Jesus where it looks like a passage has parts about his first coming and a second coming in them. And then you have some passages, of course, about just his entire redemptive career. So there's a lot to learn, obviously. That's why I recommend some of those books. I recommended at the beginning. One thing for sure I recommend, which I've always heard from a lot of Christians over the years, is that the Jews are only looking for one kind of Messiah in the first century. They're only looking for the Roman, or they're looking for the Jewish military leader kind that will overtake Rome. That he's going to set the Jews free from Roman oppression. He's like a military kind of leader of some kind or some kind of warrior. That's what Christians think the only thing the Jews may have been looking at in the first century. But too much information has come out over the last 3 or 4 decades, 5 decades, that's just simply false now. So just don't repeat that. Keep saying that to your friends. Oh, Jews don't believe in Jesus. Well, they wanted a Messiah who would get rid of the Romans, and Jesus didn't do it. That's why they rejected him. That's kind of pretty simplistic, really, because there's different kind of messianic expectations. There's the Son of God, Davidic king expectation. No doubt, Jesus has to be from the line of David. Any Messiah has to be from the line of David. Um, so that definitely has to be part of the messianic expectation, and Jesus fulfills that. That's what Son of God is. The Son of God is the Davidic king, right? So he asks, what's it mean to say Jesus is the Son of God? Someone who has a unique relationship with the Father, a relationship that no one else has ever had, but he's also the king. He's the Davidic king, not just an earthly king, not just like King David. He's the ultimate Davidic king. And he reigns on the throne of David forever because of his resurrection. Then we found out that Jews also had an expectation of a transcendent divine Messiah. There's some evidence that they were open to a divine Messiah. That's where we get kind of the Son of Man passages from, which we'll talk about. Then we know that they're also seen to be looking for a prophet like Moses, because if you read the book of John, they'll say about Jesus, they'll say, is he the prophet? Is this the prophet? They keep saying that, maybe he's the prophet, right? They're looking for that prophet from Deuteronomy 18, which I'll talk about more in a second. And then we found out when we got hold of the Dead Sea Scrolls, all those scrolls that they were found in the Qumran community in Israel, which you can go see there. You can read them online, but they got hold of these scrolls, and what they could read or translate was, it seems like that community, that Qumran community, seemed to be expecting two different kinds of messiahs. They thought one was priestly. He's like a priest, some sort of atoning messiah, kind of like what the New Testament teaches. And also he's a king. So really not saying a whole lot different from the New Testament. The New Testament believes that Jesus is a priest and a king because he makes atonement for sin. And he's a priest in the order of Melchizedek, right? But he's also a reigning Davidic king. So having said that, let me mention some of this is my opinion. Obviously, you don't have to agree. I mean, if some of you study Messianic prophecy in spend a lot of time studying it, you may find more that convince you than the ones I mentioned. There's more out there, certainly, but I just want to mention some of the ones that stand out to me, the ones that I think are significant. Obviously, some of you might be like, well, we didn't talk about that and talk about this and whatever. Obviously, that's up to you. I'm just telling you this is kind of my opinion, as I said. So let's talk about the Son of Man a little bit, which it really is more significant than we think it is. Jesus as the Son of Man. Now we know that if you look at the four Gospels, we know that Son of Man is used more than any other description of Jesus. It's used 85 times in the New Testament. Every time Son of Man's used to describe Jesus, and 81 times it was used by Jesus. Christ and Messiah, describing Jesus as the Christ, is the number is 49, Son of God is 25, and Son of David is 14. So look, as much as we say Jesus is the Son of God, that's mentioned less frequently than it is that he's the Son of Man. So that's kind of interesting. And we know that it's used in different ways. We know in some places when you read the Gospels, it's simply describing Jesus's earthly ministry. Nothing divine about it. We know that it's used to describe his suffering, death, and resurrection. Certain times where Jesus says the Son of Man will suffer and die, right, and arise from the dead, right? Jesus talks about that. And then we know in some passages it describes Jesus's future. It serves as an eschatological function where Jesus will come as a judge, as the Son of Man. One day the Son of Man will come in the clouds, right? And he'll judge humanity. So it's got a future role is there as well. It's Psalm 8, Son of Man can just mean a human being, right? When you read Psalm 8:4, what is man that you think of him, and Son of Man that you're concerned about him, right? That's Ben Adam. So, that just means son of Adam. Okay. And then it's used in Ezekiel. We know if you read Ezekiel that Ezekiel is mentioned over, it's mentioned over 90 times in the book, and referring to Ezekiel. Now we know that Ezekiel and Jesus are not the same. We know when Jesus is referring to himself as the Son of Man, he's not saying, "Hey, I'm just like Ezekiel." No big difference, no big deal, right? What's a big deal? Big whoopee, whoopee dee doo all day. I mean, Ezekiel's called Son of Man, but that's not what's happening with Jesus. Okay. Um, the translation of Son of Man, Ezekiel, in Daniel 7:13, as we'll talk about, is the same in English, but it was different in the original language. Ezekiel, of course, was written in Hebrew, and Daniel 7:13 was written in Aramaic. So we really need to hone in on is Daniel. And we know that in the book of Daniel, it talks about these five kingdoms. Okay. And we know that in the fifth kingdom, this kingdom is the one that's supposed to come during the Roman Empire. Okay. And that's the context where the Son of Man comes into the forefront. Okay. Like in Daniel 7. And we know that this kingdom will never end. This is an everlasting kingdom. Okay. It's not like these other kingdoms will be destroyed. This is an everlasting kingdom that'll go on and on that Daniel's talking about. Okay. And that has to do with Jesus being the Son of Man, as that's all tied in with Jesus being the Son of Man. And so when you read Daniel 7, we know that it says that passage, Daniel 7:13-14, it says, I saw in the night visions, and behold, there came with the clouds of heaven one who is like a son of man. He was brought before the Ancient of Days, and came up to him. Dominion and glory and a kingdom were given to him, and all the peoples, nations, and tongues worshipped him. His dominion will be eternal, not be taken away. His kingdom will not come to an end. So you see in this passage, there's two figures, right? There's the Ancient of Days. One is sitting on a throne, and another one's brought standing in front of him, right? And the one sitting is called the Ancient of Days, which obviously is a reference to God. But then you have this other figure who is like a human being, but he's also divine. He's given this authority over the nations, right? He's given, I mean, all the nations and tons worship this individual. He has a dominion that will be eternal, not be taken away. He has an everlasting kingdom, okay? So his government isn't just like it's not just a political entity, it's an eternal kingdom, okay? And we know, oops, oh, I screwed that up. Sorry. Went way back. Let's get back to Son of Man. I apologize. I don't know what happened there. I must have hit something. I'm almost there. Okay, there I am. So we know that this figure is God's bringing this figure over the angelic realm in a heavenly court scene, right? And we know that when any figures where it says that all the people will serve him, the nations will serve him, that means there's some sort of reverential issue here, right? To this figure. All the peoples, nations, and languages will serve this figure. And so the Son of Man is given, we see this figure is given a dominion, glory, and a kingdom. Okay. And we know there's a contrast between these temporary kingdoms, as I mentioned, right back on the other slide about those temporary kingdoms, and then this is a kingdom that lasts forever. Okay, this king's kingdom will go on and on and on. Okay, and then we know that Jesus, of course, like I said, it's talked a lot about in the eschatological future. When Jesus judges, he's referred to as the Son of Man. He comes in his glory, he judges humanity. We also know that in the trial scene in Mark, I don't have to have the slide here, but we know in the trial scene in Mark 14, when the priests ask Jesus, he says, "Are you the Messiah?" And Jesus says, "I am, and you'll see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of glory, and he'll be sitting at the right hand of the Father, coming at the right hand." So the priest rips his robe and says blasphemy, right? So Jesus used the Son of Man saying to refer a lot to his future eschatological function, which will be judgment, which only God can do. By the way, only God has the authority to judge, but the Son of Man has the authority to bring judgment as well, which is Jesus. But here's what's interesting. Have you ever noticed in Mark chapter 9, when Jesus, this passage here, when Jesus says, "Take heart, your sins are forgiven," and then some of the scribes said to themselves, they accuse Jesus of blasphemy here, okay? Because Jesus is now saying he has the authority to forgive sins. Remember, you had to go to the temple to have your sins forgiven. Tells the person your sins are forgiven. And then they say that's blasphemy. And then Jesus says, "Why do you think evil in your hearts? For which is easier to say your sins are forgiven, or to say stand up and walk? But so you may know the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins." He then said to the paralytic, "Stand up, take your bed, and go home." And he stood up and went to his home. And the crowd saw it. They were filled with awe and glorified God. So you notice how Jesus, the reason he has authority to forgive sins, he says, because he's the Son of Man. Okay, because he's God in man, he's this divine figure that Daniel 7 talks about, as I just mentioned. Jesus has been given that authority. He has that authority to forgive sins. Okay, it's direct relationship to him being the Son of Man. Okay. Um, and as I say here, although contemporary readers may think of sin as having only moral, spiritual consequences, Jewish scripture often draws a causal connection between human sin and physical illness. For example, in the Pentateuch, God tells the Israelites through Moses, if they listen carefully, the commandments, and obey them, he will not bring any of the diseases of the Egyptians upon them, because he is the Lord who heals. It's kind of interesting. But when Jesus is declaring the man's sins to be forgiving, he knows that, he's making a claim that something only God can do. Because in the book of Exodus, we know that God, when he appears on Mount Sinai with Moses, he reveals his name. He says he's a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin. So the ability to forgive sin is tied directly to God's name. Okay. And God, the God of Israel, is the only one that can do it, but Jesus gets to do it too. Jesus is doing the same thing. And so, very similar to when we read like Leviticus about all those sin offerings, right? When it describes the animal sacrifices, it talks about how it's the Lord who forgives. And we know that the priest makes the atonement, right? They bring the offering, the priest goes in the temple and tabernacle and makes atonement. But of course, it's God who forgives. But now Jesus can do the same thing without going into the temple to do it. He is the temple in person. And what happens is when the scribes hear this and they declare they say he's a blasphemer, you have to look at what would qualify as blasphemy in the first century. Okay, when they accuse him of blasphemy, what would be considered blasphemy is where you would not you would take the sacred name of God and say something about God's name, or drag his name through the mud. Kind of like in Ezekiel, when Ezekiel told the audience that God said, "You've profaned my name, and now I'm going to vindicate my name." So if you misuse God's name, that can be considered blasphemy. Um, Also blasphemous would be derogatory speech against sacred leaders or priests, or words against the Jerusalem temple. That's why sometimes they get mad at Jesus. They thought he was saying negative things against the temple. Or number four, just speaking or acting if you're equal with God. That would be totally blasphemy. Total blasphemy. Okay. And so, therefore, we could say that Jesus got the charge of number 4 here because he's speaking or acting as equal with God. When the God of Israel only has the authority to forgive sins, and then Jesus comes along and says, "Your sins are forgiven." That's blasphemy. He got accused of blasphemy. You can see how they come at him about it, right? So, as I say here, Jesus uses the expression in the context of interaction with the paralytic. He's alluding to a specific figure. The Son of Man is the authority. And many scholars, of course, agree he's referring to Daniel 7, that he's the Son of Man. And you see how the crowds react? It says, when the crowd saw it, they were filled with awe and they glorified God who had given such authority to human beings, right? They were all amazed and glorified God. We've never seen anything like this. Amazement seized all of them, and glorified God, were filled with awe, saying, we've seen strange things today. Okay. Second text that I think has significance is the prophet of Deuteronomy 18, 15 to 18. In this passage, this is where God says he's going to raise up a prophet who's going to be like Moses. Deuteronomy 15 to 18, it says, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your brothers. It is to him you shall listen, just as your desired of the Lord your God on the day of assembly, when you said, let me hear not again the voice of the Lord my God, or see this great fire anymore, I die. And the Lord said to me, they are right in what they spoke, and will raise up for them a prophet like you among the brothers. And I'll put my words in their mouth, in his mouth, and will speak to them all I've commanded him. Whoever will not listen to the words that he says, he shall speak in my name, I myself required of him. But the prophet who presumes to speak a word in my name, that have not commanded him to speak, or speaks in the name of other gods, that prophet shall die. And if you say in your heart, how will we know the word of the Lord is not spoken? When a prophet speaks in the name of the Lord, if the word does not come to pass or come true, it is a word that the Lord has not spoken. The prophet spoken presumptuously. You not be afraid of him. So this is a prediction about someone that'll be raised up like Moses, a prophet like Moses. Now, there are other prophets that came after this for sure. I mean, you had Elijah, you had um, Elijah. I mean, you had other prophets in the Old Testament, but they have to be like Moses. I mean, you have to do some things very specifically similar to Moses. We know that God says in Deuteronomy 18, he says that I'll put my words in this prophet's mouth. You speak to them all that I command him. So God's going to be telling this prophet, giving him the words to speak. And we know that in Jesus' ministry, especially in the book of John, he constantly says the Father has given him the words to speak, right? You see it over and over that the Father has given him a commandment, what to say, what to speak. He says, I did not speak of my own initiative, but the Father himself who sent me has given me a commandment as what to say and what to speak. I speak just as the Father told me. I've given them the words that you gave me. Okay. So, it's very similar to what the prophet was promised what God was talking about, Deuteronomy 18, about the prophet has to speak the words of God. We know Jesus emphasized this a lot in his ministry. But what else is different is that if you're going to be a prophet like Moses, you're going to have to do miracles. Okay, because Moses was a sign prophet. He did signs to show he was a true prophet. God told him, when you're going to go talk to Pharaoh, I'm going to do these signs for you. Because Moses, we know, struggled with the calling he had. And God said that these signs will confirm you're a true prophet, right? And then we know that God does those signs or miracles, right? When he goes in to talk to Pharaoh and he does all these miracles, he's got to do these signs. And of course, we know Pharaoh doesn't necessarily listen, but the point is that whatever prophet's going to come from Deuteronomy 18 is going to have to do miracles as well, like Moses. He's going to have to do these signs. Okay. And of course, Jesus does that. He does that, especially in the book of John. The book of John is called the book of signs sometimes because of all these passages about signs Jesus does. Nicodemus comes to him and says, there's no way you could be doing these signs unless you're from God. And we know that Jesus does all these things. in the book of John, these signs or miracles like Moses did. Even Peter says in Acts chapter 2, he says, Jesus the Nazarene is a man accredited by God to you by miracles, signs, and wonders. So then we know when we read the New Testament that they expected the prophet. They began to think that Jesus was the prophet like Moses because what he was doing was predicted in Deuteronomy 18. He's speaking like the prophet and he's acting like the prophet, what the prophet's supposed to do. He's doing these miracles. He's speaking in the Father's authority. God's giving the words to speak. So Jesus is the fulfillment of the prophet like Moses. Of course, Moses was a deliverer too, right? He delivered Israel out of the Egyptian bondage. We know that Jesus redeems us or delivers us out of the bondage of sin. Jesus fulfills the Exodus, right? The true Exodus. The Jewish people came out of Israel, or came out of Egypt. They're delivered out of the bondage of slavery into redemption. And we know that Jesus redeems us out of the bondage of sin, right? He's a greater Moses, right? He's the ultimate prophet. Not a lot of doubt that Jesus did miracles. Most scholars agree that Jesus was some kind of miracle worker. By even skeptical scholars or not even Orthodox Christians, that Jesus was perceived as a miracle worker. He was perceived as an exorcist. Those are some quotes there, but there's just too much evidence that in all the records that Jesus was considered a miracle worker. Now, he wasn't just a miracle worker. There's some unique things about his miracles. I don't have time to go into that completely. There is a passage from the Dead Sea Scrolls that predicted when the Messiah, they believe that when the Messiah comes, he'll do these things. It sounds exactly what Jesus did in Matthew chapter 11. There's a scroll that says heaven and earth will obey. It's actually 4Q521. That's the name of the scroll. But it says heaven and earth will obey his Messiah, and all that is in them will not turn away from the commandments of the holy ones. For the Lord will honor the pious upon the throne of the eternal kingdom, setting prisoners free, open the eyes of the blind, raising up those who bow down, heal the wounded, revive the dead, proclaim good news to the poor. Now, if you read Matthew chapter 11, when John the Baptist is in prison, Jesus tells his disciples to go tell John that, when the Messiah comes, the blind will see, the poor will be, the prisoners will be free. All these things that happen in this scroll were similar to what Jesus told John to believe about when the Messiah shows up. These are things he's going to do. Okay. Now, also, I think that something else is kind of interesting. I think that it's a little harder prophecy to understand. You've got to study it, but I think it's certainly has some weight to it. Is the fact that when the Messiah comes, he'll have to make atonement before 70 AD. So we have a timeline in Daniel 9 of the first coming of the Messiah. We have this decree that's given about restoring and rebuilding Jerusalem. And then we have these passages about where an anointed one will be cut off, okay, and he'll have a atoning role. Okay, this is what we call Daniel's, the 70 weeks, the weeks of Daniel and Daniel 9. We know that Nebuchadnezzar had Jerusalem destroyed around 587 BC. And we know that when this prophecy was given, Daniel 9, Jerusalem was still in ruins. And so you have this prophecy or this decree that Jerusalem will be rebuilt. And there will be seven 7-year periods, and 62 more 7-year periods, or 483 years until the Messiah would show up. So, you get into the math, it's 62 7-year periods, or the 483rd year, the Messiah be cut off. Okay. And it is true that there's been a lot of debate over the 70 weeks. The phrase may be kind of ambiguous, but we know when you read the context that Daniel's praying, and we know that he's talking about the fulfillment of a specific 70-year period, the 70 years of the Babylonian captivity. It's prophesied by Jeremiah. So Daniel receives this prophecy about the 70 weeks in his prayer. So the weeks are sets of 7 years, and the prophecy foretells a period 7 times 70 weeks yet to come, or 77-year periods, 490 years. Now, the thing is, I know this debated a little bit like, well, let me go back to this. So when it comes to the kind of calendar they use and whether it's exactly 173, 880 days, whether it's exactly hitting the spot of 33 AD or whether it's somewhat in that range, like 33 to 35, 30, so whatever, I don't think that really matters. It doesn't have to be absolutely pinpoint bulleted 33 AD, because I think that when you see this, when it says in Daniel 9, 77s are decreed for your people in your holy city to finish transgression, to put an end to sin, to atone for wickedness, to bring everlasting righteousness, seal up the vision, prophecy, anoint the most holy place. I don't think there's anybody else. Someone has to fulfill those criteria. That criteria. Someone needs to come who will finish transgression, put an end to sin, atone for wickedness, and bring in everlasting righteousness. Okay, to seal up the vision, prophecy, anoint the most holy. So that talks about the eradication of sin and the establishment of righteousness. Okay, somebody has to fulfill that prophecy, those specific criteria of the prophecy. I don't know who else it's going to be, other than Jesus. If you have another figure that really could do that, um, it basically is showing that when the Messiah shows up and presents himself to the nation, he's cut off sometime near the range of AD 33, somewhere in that time frame, 33 to 37 AD, somewhere around there. And we know that the prophecy goes on to say that subsequent to Messiah's death, the people, the prince who's come, will destroy the city and the sanctuary. So we know that within one generation of Jesus' crucifixion, that did happen. Okay, Jerusalem was destroyed, temple was destroyed. So it's interesting, though, that the rabbis, after Jesus left, later on when the rabbinical literature was written after Jesus died, was resurrected, they began to see a case for two messiahs in the Old Testament. They saw one Messiah that seemed to be a reigning kind of a divine Messiah that comes on the clouds, and it says, if Israel's worthy, the Messiah will come on the clouds. And they would look at Daniel 7:13. But then they said, but if Israel's not worthy, he comes lowly and riding on a donkey. So it's kind of interesting that they kind of see a two-act play of the Messiah after Jesus is gone. And so that's exactly what we believe. We believe that when the Messiah comes, it's a two-act play. He first suffers, makes atonement for sin. He's a priest, makes atonement. He's rejected mostly. He's misunderstood. And then the other prophecies talk about the reigning ruling aspect of the Messiah, right? He's a king. And that's why we believe Jesus fulfills both those roles. He's a suffering, atoning Messiah, but he also is a reigning, ruling Messiah. Okay. And then I just want to mention what I mentioned last week, just to summarize. I kind of talked about this last week, just to kind of, sounds a little bit repetitive, but I talked about how Jesus is the only Jewish figure in the history of mankind who's founded a religion of 1.4 billion non-Jews. Because we know the majority of people who believe in Jesus today are mostly Gentiles. Okay. Yes, there's Jews who believe, but they're the minority. But it's interesting that when Abraham was promised that the nations will be blessed through his seed, that the promise goes out of Israel to the nations, right? Of course, Jesus is from the seed of Abraham, but we know that all the nations are going to be benefiting from that promise. Okay. Now, so God takes this little piece of land in a covenant with Abraham and tells him that his name will be great, and through his name, all the nations will be blessed. Now, we know that Israel is called to uh, image God, to image the one true God. When the nations look at Israel, they would say, oh, they have the one true God. They would say, let's leave our polytheism, let's leave our paganism, let's go worship the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. So, looking at Israel should be, they're supposed to be a light. They're supposed to be different. And so Israel has a unique calling to the world to point people to the one true God. Of course, they didn't do that all the time. They made mistakes and sin. But the calling, as Paul says in Romans 9 through 11, God still has a calling on them. If you disagree, read Romans 9 through 11. So we know that there's passages about Gentiles joining Israel in the end times, like they're going to be united with Israel, coming next to the God of Israel, coming to Israel in the Old Testament. So Gentiles always were supposed to play a role in Israel's destiny. They're light to the nations, and then the Gentiles are supposed to cling to them. The Israel's supposed to bless the nations, and the nations are supposed to bless Israel. Reciprocal, right? Even rabbis have said, when the Messiah comes, like he says, like one rabbi says here, when King Messiah shall be revealed, all the nations of the world shall be gathered to him. So the Messiah has a universal role. Just like Israel has a universal role to reach the nations, to show the nations who the one true God is, Jesus, or the Messiah, is Israel's ideal representative. Okay, and he helps them fulfill their calling. And look at another rabbi says, Moses, through what he did, drew out Israel's worship to God. Israel's supposed to hear about what Moses did and worship God. Of course, they didn't. They fell right into idolatry. But this rabbi says the Messiah will draw all nations to the worship of God. So it's obviously the Messiah is supposed to draw the nations to the one true God. And then I talked last week about how when you read the suffering servant passages, especially Isaiah 42:4 and Isaiah 49:1-7, it talks about a servant who will come and he will be rejected by his nation, but the Gentile nations will bow down to him. Okay, he'll be the salvation of this individual will provide salvation to the ends of the earth. He'll be a light to the Gentiles, but not necessarily accepted by the nation of Israel, right? Sounds similar to what happened to Jesus' life. And, let's face it, you're kind of off to a tough start when you're crucified in the first century and the majority of your people reject you and they misunderstand your mission. But it just turns out that what you do opens the door to 1.4 billion Gentiles or non-Jews coming to faith in the one true God. Okay? We know that in Jesus' ministry in Matthew and Luke, that he's called the Gentiles will put their hope in him. He's a light of revelation to the Gentiles, right? So we have empirical evidence that Jesus came to the nation of Israel. He was crucified by Roman crucifixion. And of course, we believe there's good empirical evidence he rose from the dead. But the point is that we have empirical evidence that he was rejected by the majority of Jews in the first century, not all of them, but the majority of them. We have empirical evidence that all around the world today that there's billions of non-Jews who came to know the one true God through the ministry of Jesus the Jew. So Jesus the Jew leads a bunch of non-Jews into a covenant relationship with God. And that's prophetic. That is in the Old Testament, that's prophetic. None of these figures did that. They all died. Josephus lists some of these guys. They led revolts against Rome. They all got squashed and killed. They're all dead. But Jesus just happens to be the only one who died as well and happened to be crucified, that his following has gone on and his mission or his message is spread throughout the whole world. And many, many non-Jews have heard about it. Many non-Jews come into a relationship with the one true God. So that's unique. And that's why we're grafted in as well through what Jesus did. So that's about all I have tonight. Messianic prophecy, there's much more, but those are some of the ones I think are significant. Okay. And by the way, I use this prophecy a lot about Jesus reaching Gentiles and prophetically the way the Abrahamic covenant works, and then the way everything I explained here. I use this with Jews a lot because if they say to me, "Well, Jesus isn't the Messiah because he didn't do blah 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 blah," I said, "Yeah, but it's also talked about in the Old Testament that um, in the Abrahamic covenant that all the nations will be blessed through the seed of Abraham, and Jesus is from the seed of Abraham." And it talks about how Israel's supposed to reach the nations, not like go on missionary journeys, but they're supposed to be a light to the nations, and how Jesus has been a light to all the nations, and how he has helped all these non-Jews come to faith in the God of Israel. And that can really provoke Jews to jealousy. Trust me, I've had those conversations. So you might want to remember that sometimes if you ever have a chance to talk to Jewish people. So that's about all I have. And